Hi everybody, welcome back. Today we're going to be discussing the anatomy of the brain, and I'm holding a brain model in my hand. And let's look first at the things on the outside of the brain that you can see. So the part up here that kind of looks like a brain is actually the cerebrum. And the part in the back on the posterior inferior side is actually the cerebellum. You can also see, if you look at it from the front, you can see this little part hanging down. This is the brain stem, and we're going to look at that in more detail in a minute. And the lobes of the brain are pretty much named after the bones that they sit under. So in the front here, this is called the frontal lobe. Behind it is called the parietal lobes. On the side, this slice right here would be the temporal lobe, and in the back is the occipital lobe. So again, the occipital lobe is primarily where your vision centers are and the processing of your visual input is. And on the sides, the temporal lobe is primarily where you're going to be processing hearing. You can also see that this brain kind of splits apart. Now, obviously your brain doesn't totally fall apart when somebody pulls on it, but there is a split between the left and the right hemisphere. And that split is called the longitudinal fissure. And it goes all the way down. If you had a real brain in your hands, you could actually stick your finger in there because the two sides of the brain aren't connected until they get down to this part down here, the corpus callosum. Something else you might notice on here are there are a lot of ridges and a lot of grooves. And there's one main groove that you're responsible for, and that's called the central sulcus. And it goes all the way across from one side, the temporal lobe on one side, to the temporal lobe on the other side. So you can see that groove. That's called the central sulcus. And anterior to the central sulcus, pre-central sulcus, we have this thing, it's marked in blue on this side, but it's also on this side as well. And that's going to be your primary motor cortex. So anytime you decide to move your skeletal muscles, the motor plan originates from this area. So anytime you move the muscles on the left side of your body, the primary motor cortex on the right side of the brain is the one that's originating the move. Likewise, if you're moving the muscles on the right side of your body, the primary motor cortex on the left side is the one that's originating those movements. Just behind it, on the other side of the central sulcus, you can see it's outlined in red here. That's going to be the somatosensory cortex. So that's where all all sensory input is coming in from your body. So, touch, vibrations, all of those things, all of your somatic input comes to this somatosensory cortex right here. So if we were to open up the brain and look at it from a mid-sagittal cut, you can see here's the cerebrum, here's the cerebellum, and there's a structure in here that kind of looks like a little bird. Here's his eye, here's the crest, here's his beak, there's like a little maybe seed hanging off of it, and here's his body and his tummy. The crest of the bird is called the corpus callosum, and again, that's where tracks from one side of the brain cross over to the other side of the brain. Right here where the bird beak is the hypothalamus. And you'll be learning lots more about the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland when you get to the endocrine system, but that's where they're located. So deep within the brain is the hypothalamus, and this little seed that's hanging off the front is the pituitary gland. The brain stem is this part right here. It consists of the midbrain, which is right here, the pons, which is the bird belly, and it kind of looks like a pea, and the medulla oblongata is down here. Just in back of the midbrain, we have a couple of structures we need to learn. Right here, this bump that is superior is the superior colliculus, and just underneath it, this little bump right here, is the inferior colliculus. This piece here is the pineal gland, and that's what's going to secrete melatonin. The thalamus is this sort of egg-shaped structure here. And I'd like to point out the intermediate mass goes from one thalamus to the other thalamus in the other side. And I wanted to point out a couple of structures down here on the cerebellum. So the cerebellum has this white tree structure inside of it, and that's the arbor vitae. And the folia are the ridges on the cerebellum. Just like the cerebrum has ridges and grooves, the cerebellum has ridges and grooves, and those are called the folia. So remember, white matter is going to be myelinated axons, and gray matter, what surrounds this arbor vitae, is the cell bodies and dendrites. So that's where the synapses are. So the arbor vitae is actually myelinated axons. We also have a couple of what we call ventricles within the brain. So remember that we have a blood-brain barrier, which means that we don't let blood circulate through the brain, but we do need the nutrients and the oxygen that the blood brings in. So we filter that blood, and we are very careful. We allow nutrients and oxygen into the brain, and we filter the blood into cerebrospinal fluid. So the way we protect the brain is we take arterial blood and we filter it, and we make cerebrospinal fluid out of it. And we allow things like oxygen and nutrients to come into the cerebrospinal fluid, circulate through the brain, nourish the neurons, and pick up waste and take the waste away. And so there are some areas within the brain that are little cavities, hollows, if you will, where that fluid can circulate. When we look at this mid-sagittal cut, we can't see the first two cavities. They're called ventricles. The reason we can't see them is because they're kind of right under here. In order to see them, we would have to open the brain up a little bit. And in fact, that's what we can do. Do you see this little opening here that there's nothing in it? Normally, this would be filled with cerebrospinal fluid. This is called a lateral ventricle. There's one on this side, and there's one on this side. So the two lateral ventricles can't be seen in this view. This area here, it's hard to see, but you can kind of tell that this part's bumping out and this part is kind of hollow. If you put the two sides of the brain together, it forms a space. That's called the third ventricle, and normally the cerebrospinal fluid will circulate through here, and then it will go down this little channel into the fourth ventricle, which is right here, just posterior to the pons. So we have four ventricles, the two lateral ventricles, which are on either side, the third ventricle, which is right around here, and then the fourth ventricle. From there, the cerebrospinal fluid will continue down the spinal column, down into the bottom. When it comes back up, it will come back to the venous blood. If we were to take this brain and pour like plastic and use it as a mold and pour plastic into it and let the plastic harden, it would look like this. And in fact, if you take our little bird face and you look at the eye and the face and the beak, and you look at this side thing from the side, you can see how it looks like the bird face. Here's the third ventricle. And there's that little eyeball that sticks through. And here would be the hypothalamus. So this is a model of the negative space of the bird. These two big things on the top are your lateral ventricles. So we don't call them ventricle 1 and 2. We call them the lateral ventricles. The third ventricle would be sort of the face of the bird, and the fourth ventricle is right down here. And if I were to take out this piece, okay, remember here's our bird face, right here. If I were to take it out and put these two together, you can see that that open space in the brain for the ventricles fits in perfectly with our little bird face. The lateral ventricles are here, the third ventricle is in here, and the fourth ventricle is down there. If you're looking at this part of the brain, you can't really see the lateral ventricles, but you can see the third ventricle and the fourth ventricle there. We also need to be able to identify the cranial nerves on this brain model. When we're looking for the cranial nerves, you want to look on the inferior aspect of the cerebrum. And some other structures that you might notice is the cerebellum is down here, and we also have the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. Each cranial nerve is actually a pair. So you'll see cranial nerve number 1 is the olfactory nerve, but you can actually see both sides, one on each side of the brain. And the olfactory nerve is a sensory nerve. It brings in information about what you're smelling to the brain. The optic nerve is number 2. Number 2 is coming from bringing information from the eyeballs through the optic canal. The information, or some of it at least, is crossing over in this area right here called the optic chiasm, that's sort of right behind the pituitary gland, and is going to go to the occipital lobe where the visual association areas are. Number 3 is right under here. That is the oculomotor nerve, and that is a motor nerve. It's going to run the extrinsic eye muscles as well as the skeletal muscles of your eyelids. Number 4 is a little bit hard to see. That's the trochlear nerve. It's right in there on this side. So it's right lateral to 3. And that's going to run the superior eye muscles. So when you look up, you're actually using the trochlear nerve to send signals to your eyeballs to move upwards. Number 5 is a nice big fat nerve, so it's easy to see on both sides. That is the trigeminal nerve. And the trigeminal nerve is a mixed nerve, meaning it carries both sensory and motor impulses. So this is coming from the face, so sense of, sort of touch on your face, as well as it helps run the muscles, motor muscles, skeletal muscles used for chewing. Number 6, here and here, we've gone back towards the medial part of the pons. Number 6 is the abducens, and they run the lateral eye muscles. So if you look to one side, moving your eyes in a lateral direction uses a different muscle than using them somewhere else, and they have their own nerve for some reason. Number 7, you're moving out laterally again. This one's number 7. This one's number 7 on the other side. That is the facial nerve. The facial nerve is used to bring in information about taste and send out motor information so that you can make funny faces with your face. Number 8 is way out here on the lateral side, on both sides. Number 8 is called the vestibulocochlear nerve, and it is a sensory nerve, so it means everything's coming in on it, and it brings in information about hearing as well as balance and equilibrium. Number 9 is just below it. You can see right here. That is the glossopharyngeal nerve. So that is both sensory and motor, and that has to do with swallowing and taste. The vagus nerve is just below that. That's number 10. That is sending information, motor information out to your viscera to help control your heart rate and your breathing rate and things like that, as bring in sensory information about taste. Are you going? You want to take my car? Okay. We'll see you later. All right. Shoot, where was I? I think vagus. So 11, number 11 is here. That's the accessory nerve. That's this big long one on either side. That's actually a motor nerve, and that's going to help you move your head and your shoulder around. So it kind of runs like your neck and your shoulders. And number 12, we're jumping way back up and back to the middle. This is 12 up here. That's sort of in the middle of the medulla oblongata. That's the hypoglossal, and that's a motor neuron that's sending out motor impulses to help you move your tongue around. You use that in swallowing and in speaking. So those are the 12 cranial nerves. You need to be able to identify them on this model, as well as know the function and whether it's a sensory nerve, mixed nerve, or motor nerve. All right, that's it for today, brain structures. See you in class.